Hello, everyone. Very, very happy to be here today and, to introduce Sylwia to this amazing presentation that you will be coming soon. So thanks as well, everyone who is here today and made the time to be here. Thank you very much. There's so many people here. I'm just feeling a bit emotional even to see that there were so many people that attended this presentation. So today then, Sylwia Korsak, who I have been having a pleasure to work for a little bit at Task Network, is going to do the presentation today. So Sylwia is a practitioner in liberation psychology and also integrative counselor. And today she will present. Her presentation will be in introduction to liberated psychologies for social justice. So let's welcome them, Sylwia, to her presentation. I'll be on the chat checking any comments. John helped me with that as well. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of comments there. So, okay.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you for such a wonderful introduction. Thank you, John, as well. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, dzień dobry, jó napot kívánok. It's really, really lovely to be here. I'm going to disappear and start sharing the slides because there's quite a material to go through, but we'll also do some reflective exercises. So please just bear with me for a second. I am reading the chat on a different computer, so I will be doing my best to follow what you're asking. As Jackie said, oh, there we go. As Jackie said, I'm a liberation practitioner, but before I go into introduction, I really want to do something we do in liberation psychologies at the very beginning. I'd like to pay my gratitude to the people who have made my work possible. First of all, I would like to pay my gratitude and greetings to the ancestors from the land that I'm logging into, which currently is Bristol. This is the land of the people of the Buni. So I just want to say thanks to that and acknowledge them. I'd like to say thank you to the elders who came before me. There's a lot of them. We had a little conversation here with John, my family and everybody without whom this work and the work I do and you all do wouldn't be really possible. Thank you to Jackie, who was so magnificent over the summer. We had so many interesting conversations about liberation psychology, and my heart is also in that place, you know, that you do actually come from the part of the world where liberation psychologies come from. So I want to acknowledge that because I don't, and it's really important to get that balance right. Thank you to John and Meg and everybody else who's involved in this wonderful opening that this Therapy for Social Change network is. To all of you logging in today or watching it later, thank you. I also want to pay tribute to my clients and the tribes that hold me through this work, because again, without them, this work wouldn't be possible. It's a very collaborative work. It's a very participatory work. They need to be acknowledged. I mentioned it before in our meetings. I also have an advisory board of people who support me and who are heart and ethical compass of my business. So I'd like to mention them. And I added, when I was putting these slides together, a little bit of a personal story here. I would also like to mention the Lionesses, the female football players of UK. And I'll tell you a very quick story before we go into liberation practices, because I think it's very relevant. When I was finishing off the slides, the kind of, you know, the core part of what is going to be presented in here, I happened to be on a family holiday in Bournemouth area on a weekend when the Lionesses were playing the finals. And there were three things I've noticed, or maybe missed. I've noticed on our way, we were going to, on a day of the game, which happened around 11 a.m., we were going to Poole to have a little boat trip on the harbour. Now, unlike usually during the male finals, there was only one house that was celebrating the game. There was only one person in the pub while the pub was setting up, while the game was on. And there was actually a mention of Sydney Harbour while we were on the boat, exactly when the game was on, and the game wasn't mentioned. And it really felt like a huge loss. And so what liberation psychologists tend to do is a re-author and write the stories that don't get written. So I would really like to pay my tribute to the lionesses here. Also would like to set the tone for how we're going to work today. I appreciate that John has already done a lot of this, so just a gentle reminder to be kind and respectful to each other. Liberation practitioners usually are quite used to diversity of views and experiences, so the way to do it, just as a tip, is to always refer to your own experience. That's the safest way to avoid generalizing. Please remember that we're here to bring, to build bridges, to collaborate. And actually, I hope that through the chat, you really can share your experiences. I'm a practitioner, so I hope that you can also educate me here today. What we wouldn't do, and I recommend that we don't do it, is we won't question the very obvious othering or displacements that are happening around the world, like racist, climate change, refugee crisis, gender-based violence. This really isn't really up for discussion. However, we can talk about our experiences. And another really soft request from me is to really encourage everybody to hold their trauma. When we do this work, a lot of our stuff can get opened. And those of us who present, like myself today, we make conscious choices as to how much we share about our own traumas, and we learn to hold it and we get support for it. So please just listen into how you're feeling and what works for you, and just keep yourself on, and look out for others as well. Look out for how others might be feeling when we're sharing. And another point on complexity of views, I've noticed that sometimes when we attend presentations, the speaker would share an opinion, and then there is an assumption that they disagree with the opposite. So I'd just like to remind everybody that there is a complexity of views. Just because I say one thing, it doesn't mean I disagree with the opposite. So I invite a lot of nuance today, complexity, and just really, diversity of different views. And a note on slides, as John said, there is a lot of text because I prepared those slides so you can later on have a really good read into the areas that maybe will be of interest for you. Not everything might be relevant. If you struggle, because I know that some people attend events and struggle and get really drawn into the text and then too much is happening, try to focus on the images instead, or maybe don't even look at the screen, just listen to what I'm talking about. I will be simplifying the what's on slides, and then later on you can read about them. I hope that makes sense, and maybe we can dive into the first moment of a reflective practice and just check in with ourselves. If you feel comfortable, I only invite to share on the chat, and again, you're welcome to share it in other languages if that feels right. How are you feeling in your body right now? And if you want to respond to the other questions, that's fine too. What do you need to do to hold your trauma today in this session? And what can you do to support others through this session? But mainly, how are you in your body right now? And all opinions are welcome. So let's just take 1 minute. I have a little stopwatch in here. You don't have to share, but you're welcome to if you feel like it. Have another half a minute. Thank you for sharing. Okay, thank you. I'm not going to respond to chat because if we were to do this in a group, we would first ask people if they want a response. We sometimes don't need a response or don't feel like we want it. But I'm incredibly grateful for the fact that you shared some of your physical experiences. Oh, I'm sorry. When I downloaded this from Canva, the text went wonky, so I'm gonna send you a PDF. However, I just wanted to introduce myself so you understand who's here and speaking to you and what are my social positionings. So on the top of the line, you see my preferential experiences and the kind of money driven paid jobs, and the bottom line is my activist and social work. You can have a look at it later. At the moment, I'm a liberation practitioner and I also work as an integrative counselor, just so you understand my approach. I'm a founder of Voxer Hub, where we offer free and paid digital wellbeing counseling, coaching, consultancy, and training. What we do mainly is supporting people with negative technology bias and offering things around geek therapies, virtual reality therapies, but also nature therapies. I'm also a citizen journalist, activist, proud geek. I will say this, I'm a proud geek and I'm a gardener and like to hang out in nature. That's how I restore. I also want to bring a statement of my privileges, which is very important in this line of work. I'm Eastern European of Polish minority, recently British citizen. I'm able-bodied, white, straight, cisgender, female identifying. I have one small favor to ask for today. I'm still in Brexit trauma recovery, so if you find it difficult to spell my full name, just shorten it to Syl. I appreciate that W can be really confusing. And I'd also like to acknowledge, as I already did when Jackie was talking, that I am not from Latin America, where liberation psychologies started as we know them academically, but I do come from borderland cultures. And again, there's a bit of a mess in here, I'm so sorry, but I have a mix of preferential social positionings, if you look at my timeline, and I have a list of equally strong displacements. So I kind of stand half, one foot in here, one foot in there. And I guess that really is a bit of a prompt for us to move on to our second moment of thinking. And I'll actually give you 2 minutes to do this and try to reset this. Just like I did a minute ago, please, if you feel like it, you're invited to draw a little line or even imagine it and think about your life journey and maybe identify one preferential social positioning, privilege, or whatever words we use. Words are very tricky and we do a lot of dismantling of language in liberation psychology. So choose words that suit you. One preferential positioning, one displacement, and then think about something today, one preferential positioning, one displacement, because we use this for our work a little bit later. So just take 2 minutes to draw it, to pinpoint 4. I've left 4 just so you have an example in case we get confused. Just to remind you, one preferential positioning from the past, one displacement, whatever that means for you. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. One present preferential positioning and one displacement today. Just for you, we won't have to share this. This is just your own reflective work. So we'll start 2 minutes. And if you have questions, please post them on the chat. I can look at the chat as well. In the chat folder, and we still have a minute. This is only for you. I just want to bring a little bit of practice while we're looking at the theory, just so it doesn't feel so cognitive and theoretical in our heads, but actually a lot of liberation psychology work comes from the heart and from our nervous system. We still have half a minute. And if you find yourself in those moments of reflection that we have a little bit triggered and difficult sitting in silence, please put some music on. Sometimes silence can be triggering as well. All right, I'm going to pause in here and you will have the slides so you can fill out your timeline later if you want to. But we will move on because we have a limited amount of time today. And I apologize, sometimes I speak very fast. I will do my best to pace myself. First part is about context of liberation psychologies. Where do they sit? And we use plural because there's a really wide range of different approaches to liberation psychologies. There's not just one, and you'll find out about it a little bit later. Liberation, if we think about the journey of maybe shedding biases or unlearning, liberation sits beyond anti-oppressive practice. And here I don't mean we don't do anti-oppressive work. This is the work for life, right? We do have to do anti-oppressive work, equity work, inclusion, diversity, and equality. But liberation actually goes beyond the idea of anti-oppressive practice. And it's the space where we work with clients thinking about how life would be without those boundaries. What would it be like to be not only okay, but actually thrive? What conditions do we need for that? So just remember that liberation is beyond anti-oppressive work, which also implies that we have to do the anti-oppressive work to get that to be really good liberation practitioners. Something we talked about a lot in this space is the idea of whether healers or whether mental health practitioners fit in social change. Now, in liberation psychologies, we go back and we try to really remember that in the history of humankind, healers were always at the core of change. This isn't new. And actually, maybe sometimes we question, you will see it in the slides, what is the role of modern psychology in the process and where is the psychology situated today? When we think about liberatory approaches, the indigenous approaches to healing, they definitely sit within the community. It is a collective work. It is what we would call in counseling systemic work, but it's actually collective from top to down, from bottom to the top. And it's really fluid and integrated with all other practitioners. What's also really important is to maybe deconstruct the idea of self-care. You will see every slide I have in here is pretty much a book, because obviously it's an avenue for you to explore later. I really recommend that if you are, because many of you probably do this work already, if you're doing liberation psychology work, please really look into the trauma stewardship concept. It's a concept of taking in trauma, holding the trauma, the secondary trauma, and actually deciding how that changes us and what we let go of and who's holding it with us. So self-care, what we in the Eurocentric, Europatriarchal maybe approaches consider self-care is really a very small part of a very complex way of holding ourselves in this work and making sure that we have enough of energy to do it, because it is quite complex and sometimes heavy work. Sometimes liberation psychologies are referred to as psychologies of a broken heart. It is sometimes very sad work. Another concept we need to deconstruct in here is the word liberation itself. Historically, we would liberate from the position of privilege, and we would liberate people who are not so privileged as us. So we would go and we would be the saviors. That's not what we do in liberation psychologies. In fact, in liberation psychologies, we support everybody. So here in the UK, you will find that a lot of liberation practitioners, for example, work in areas when they support healing of perpetrators, bystanders, witnesses. The work is done across the entire spectrum of oppression, to understand the underlying mechanisms of it, and also think about how we can achieve liberation in the first place. And if there's one book you might want to read after this talk, this is the book to start with. It really introduces liberation psychologies. It's most thorough, and it really refers to everything, most of the other things that I'm going to mention today. Another thing to know about liberation psychologies is that they really respond to the challenge of passivity, feeling really disengaged from society, feeling voiceless, undocumented, very easy to manipulate. So what we're doing in liberation psychologies, we're working on regeneration of communities, regeneration of groups and individuals. Yes, we're thinking about rebuilding psychological spaces, and I know there's a conversation around safe spaces versus spaces where we can hold conflict, both are valid. But what's really important is the critical analysis of our positioning, of the meaning of our history, reauthoring who we are and how we sit. So actually what this means is connecting with the pain of our situation oftentimes, and that's why this work can be hard. And then from that place, we can move on to new practices of healing and gaining a new sense of our purpose and vision as well. And I'll give you some examples on how that can be done. Very important context to liberation psychologies is the fact that they're originally not Euro-patriarchal. They're based in liberation theologies, in feminist work, ecofeminist work, in a lot of performative arts, critical community psychologies, queer theories, performance studies, and so on. And I would also add to this, in the face of climate crisis, a lot of indigenous communities and a lot of psychologists who have already worked in the non-Euro-patriarchal way are also inviting the Euro-patriarchal communities to collaborate, to join in, to see those perspectives from a point of view of liberation psychologies. So we're all working on it, hopefully. The approach is strengths-based, and many of us do this in our daily practice. I've worked in 3 counseling services here in Bristol, and every single one of them was strengths-based. So it is actually happening in practice too. The approaches in liberation psychology work towards enhancing individuals and communities' capacities to heal themselves. So again, critical thinking, collective memory, the term reauthoring of our own story, peacemaking between different parties and within the community, and then the creative transformation. We'll talk about this maybe a little bit more. Transformative practices, reinvention and rethinking everything, including psychology itself. And that's the last point to really consider. What's really hard sometimes for those of us who have been through traditional counseling training is the fact that we will, in this line of work, question our role in the community. We will question the politics of mental health. We'll question the power within mental health, and what is the role of our work and whom does it serve? I really like that question. Whom does this work serve? Oftentimes we ask ourselves that question. Especially, I added an image of my child at the Minecraft convention, is that I work in digital well-being, and we see a lot of that in how diagnosing of mental health, possible mental health conditions around new technologies is getting introduced because it's happening right now. So whom does this work serve is the question we ask ourselves. And here's again where we're going to pause a little bit and come back to our personal timeline. And there's more questions here. I appreciate that some people don't like many questions, so just choose one. Think about strengths you've exhibited in your past displacements, but also preferential positionings. Think about the people who supported you, what resources and privileges you had to move forward, and how you can reorder your sense of identity. And in liberation psychologies, we actually don't consider identity to be a static concept. It's performative. We perform different identities. We perform different parts of our identities. And then look at the present challenges, that challenge that you put on the bottom here, and see whether you can maybe tap into your strengths, your community, people who support you to move forward from the current displacement. And I'll give you another 2 minutes for this, because I appreciate that this is a little bit complex and incredibly simplified just for the presentation today. So 2 minutes to really feel into your past displacement, privilege, resources, strengths, communities. See how you can move forward from the current one. Who is there to support you today? What privileges, strengths can you tap into? Reimagine, reauthor your displacement. We have 1 more minute. And half a minute. And of course you can come back to this later. None of this work is linear. It's always, we think in cycles, we think in various directions, really. Whatever works for us. And I'm going to have to move on. I feel like this is like a running little marathon and stopping now and again. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into the theory, and some of it might be repeating itself, but hopefully it will give you some pointers. So again, going back to Watkins and Schulman, strengths and agency are at the core of liberation psychology. Is it really difficult to do when we're in position of power as a practitioner in the room? So really, we need to look at acknowledging what the wounds were for people, supporting their historical memories, their critical reflections, the remembering of their story, and incredibly, what can be really difficult, we really need to foster their very subjective response to their own stories. So it is about education, it is about supporting people to remember their story and waking up to their agency, which could be something that we have to hold with the client, for the client, and then gradually let go of it for them and support them in carrying it forward. So it is performative, it's quite creative and incredibly rewarding. The very important element of liberation psychologies is to question what psychology is doing in society. And I will honor the founder of liberation psychologies, Ignacio Martin-Baró, by just reading up this one very important quote that I think we all need to keep in mind. The task of the psychologist must be to achieve the de-alienation of groups and persons by helping them attain a critical understanding of themselves and their reality. There's no person without family, no learning without culture, no madness without social order, and therefore there can be neither can there be I without we, knowing without symbolic system, a disorder that does not have reference to moral and social norms. In fact, Ignacio Martin-Baró was so outspoken about this that he ended up being assassinated. So it's quite a powerful message, and what has happened in response to those messages has also been quite incredible. And he has left a legacy behind him. This is his friend who was asked in this YouTube video that you're going to have a link to. He was asked about, how the Latin American liberation psychology movements can be translated into Western Eurocentral psychologies, and the response was that actually that's not how this approach should maybe be considered. It's not about translating, it's about really stepping away from who's in power and whose service we're doing it, who's popular in the field of psychology, actually thinking about what is the problem and how can we collectively solve it. It's not even how the frameworks work, but how can we solve the problem. So we move away from a lot of ways of how we used to work, critically review them and reinvent them to solve the emerging problems. I really recommend that video, it's really powerful. Many of you probably know Paulo Freire, fantastic, and increasingly we can, another challenge with liberation psychologies is because they are quite offensive towards mainstream psychology, a lot of them weren't published. So I'm really glad to see that Paulo Freire's work and Martin-Baró's work is increasingly more accessible in really good bookshops and online bookshops. Paulo Freire worked in education, and those of us who studied, I trained as a teacher first, I came across him in my educational studies, but he's really doing what I talked about earlier. He's looking at the idea of oppression, and in education it comes up a lot. In fact, my parents were educational activists, so maybe that's why it resonates a lot. You know, empowering people, educating people to their own agency is something incredibly important. But the first step is actually, and this will come up in the practice, I'm going to, in some of the practical frameworks I'm going to show you, the first step is really to realize oftentimes the internalized oppression and wake up to the situation that people might be in. And this is quite a difficult process to go through as well. So we play a very important role in that. I'm incredibly excited about the fact that the current president-elect of the American Psychological Association, Dr. Tamar Bryant, is a liberation practitioner, and that she has written a book last year, which, as she says in interviews, is designed to be accessible. It's actually a self-help book, so I recommend it to every practitioner. It's great. And it also explains liberation psychologies in practice. So it's really important maybe to think about how we do it before we practice it with our clients. I love the idea of homecoming, you know, thinking about how we can be okay, better than okay, belong, and feel like we have not only permission, but actually all the conditions provided to thrive and what that means. So yes, so we're thinking about who is dictating our lives. And just yesterday at the Mental Health and Wellbeing Global Summit, she also added a really important point around indigenizing psychology. So what we also do is we remind ourselves as practitioners that psychology as a field or academic field doesn't hold monopoly over healing. And that's a really good point to start from, because it makes us more humble, but also opens up the perspective to other opportunities and to other collaborations. If you listen to her podcast or watch her videos, you will see the work she does in different communities, really encouraging, validating people's original ways of healings, and that's actually quite beautiful. Here in London, we have Taiwo Afwape, I hope I'm pronouncing the name properly, wonderful psychodynamic practitioner who's also looking at, this is a really good introduction to liberation psychology from the UK perspective. She's also really pointing towards something that historically in Eurocentric white psychologies we would do with clients expressing resistance. We would traditionally think about resistance as something to conquer, something to get rid of, something to go beyond. And that resistance, yes, is a signal of something that might be going on for the client, but we're actually trying to change that. Whereas in liberation psychologies, oftentimes we think about resistance as a sign that the power is invisible and might be reenacted in not always helpful for the client ways. So resistance is actually really important to listen to. Resistance is very important to validate, to acknowledge, even celebrate in some cases. And if you think about practical examples of having a client who comes from oppressed group, the resistance actually can make a lot of sense. So it's really important to maybe question our own historical approach to resistance as a practitioner and explore what it means to the client, at least with a little bit of curiosity. Really recommend the book. as we talked, and there's increasingly a lot of literature around the history of mental health and questioning the history of mental health. This is a really tiny thin book, but I have to admit I had to rest between every chapter. It's really hard hitting, and a really great introduction to where the provision of mental health support is coming from, and what are the more political, economical underlying mechanisms that have affected how we support people in psychological professions. This is UK based, incredibly interesting, very newly published, so I really strongly recommend Misha's work. Misha's currently actually going to a lot of independent bookshops doing talks still, I hope, so you can maybe catch her in person. My personal favorite is the work of Ray Johnson. They're a non-binary practitioner in the US who recently published the book Embodied Activism. And it's what's really beautiful, as I mentioned, this is an embodied work. A lot of power imbalance, a lot of oppression is very much non-verbal. And in fact, when we start to verbalize it and cognitively try to explain it, it becomes impossible because we get trapped in the systems designed for us not to be able to articulate them. It's really easy if we develop a really good listening mechanisms with our bodies and reconnect with our bodies and our broken hearts. It's very easy to have a felt sense of where oppression, where power sits in the room. And I bet most of you have experienced that. I hope not in a really negative way, but there's a felt sense of what's going on, where the power is, and how it can be shifted. So we now have a new term called micro interventions, micro validations, for example. How can we do it verbally, but also how can we do it in terms of physical space? How much space does one person take in the room versus another? I have a personal practice where I always step off the pavement if a person of color walks in front of me, because there's a tendency for them to step off the pavement because I'm white. There are practices that we can put in place that are incredibly powerful. This book, in fact, is a toolkit for practitioners. It's full of interventions, it's full of wonderful practices, and each chapter addresses a different aspect of embodied practices. We'll come back to it in a minute as well. We also need to think about the history of language and our relationship with nature. So I'm not going to talk about this a lot, but David Abrams is doing a lot of work around explaining how we've distanced ourselves from nature, which then starts to make sense when we think about climate distress and how we relate to climate change. The other idea here is to bring, and I'm really intentionally trying to bring some feminist voices as well, Mina Salami's recent book on sensuous knowledge and coming from the heart, but also her idea reminding us that the power is something that belongs to everybody, that the power is there, power as it is. And yes, historically it has been appropriated, but if we come back to the idea of power as a self-actualizing tendency of a driving force, it becomes a little bit easier to navigate it. So I really recommend her book. We also need to remind ourselves how leadership worked. Leaders initially were chosen for being, well, strong, wise, but also caring and kind, and that's the bit somehow we've forgotten. So Simon Sinek's work in leadership and in business practices is incredible. It's not very difficult to set up a business that cares. That equal pay, in fact, has been shown to increase productivity up to 30% across the company. So, there's evidence that true leadership can actually help, and that's a form of liberation as well. We also look at imagination. We also look at reimagining and moving away from the question why to what if and why not, and having different versions of the future. Otherwise, we're not going to know where to head with it. Another element I would bring in from the part of work that I do in liberation psychologies is the value of play. It is in play and joy that we become biologically wired for positivity. So it's really important to think about it. And if you want to understand how gaming, for example, has changed and quite revolutionized and brought in positive psychology into psychology, I really invite you to read Jane McGonigal. And finally, I have mentioned it on the group, we also need to think about this idea of us never really knowing. Is this right? What's going to be the next thing? What is the post-activism? And the post-activism is really pretty much now presented by Dr. Bayako Molafe, and it's this idea of really thinking about how Afrocentric psychology might end up supporting us unlearning the Eurocentric, the Europatriarchal approaches, and maybe we can meet somewhere, maybe we can dance together, maybe we can reinvent things in a way that hasn't been seen before, and that's okay too. We will hopefully figure it out. So I'll stop here for just a minute. I'll give you 1 minute because I appreciate this is a lot of theory and I have some practical tips for you as well. But any of those questions, if they resonate, just spend 1 minute thinking about how you can use embodied practices on your daily basis in your practices at work, maybe how you can support others from their displacements, and how you can start questioning in a healthy way, not in a threatening way, but in a kind and caring way, your role in liberation of other people. So just take 1 minute to look at that. And half a minute. And we're going to stop here, and I will not go through them in depth, but I will leave those with you. They're practical approaches and frameworks where you can really focus on the how. I know a lot of you in our Therapy for Social Change lectures said that you missed practical. This is the practical. How to embody liberation psychologies. The book is full of examples. It's a lot of work around our somatic bandwidth, or physical kinesthetic empathy, listening to our bodies, reconnecting with our hearts. The work of Judith Herman is probably known to many of you if you work in trauma. Healing relationship, stabilizing safety, allowing time for grieving, reconnecting and connecting with others. The work of Dr. Thema Bryant, and also the kind of underlying Latino model in the States called HEART, where we look at those traumas, we look at grieving, we look at creating mutual communities of support. But she is also adding exploring and holding anger and rage, which is really important for this work, and then celebrating resistance. In fact, she also talks about modeling resistance for the clients, which is also part of her work. I don't think I need to introduce power threat meaning framework, but it's a bit of a classic in liberation psychologies right now, because it really helps us to pinpoint the power, how it operates, but also how subjectively different people make meaning from it. And I'd really like to encourage you to reread the 5 Ways of Wellbeing report, and notice that in the appendix, there are systemic factors that have been mentioned as well. I think the New Economics Foundation were really brave to highlight that the report was commissioned to look at the individual factors. Liberation psychologies is a systemic work, and we now start to understand just how important it is to also look at workplace, nature, and nutrition, and other elements of our health. And finally, I would really like to finish with passing on to a person who lives in Oxfordshire. Lucia Sarmiento Verano did a beautiful workshop on liberation psychologies this Monday. I really recommend following her online. She really understands the heart and the south of therapy. And if you're interested in liberation psychologies, she's a really great starting point to see what's happening today and how to put it in practice. She's wonderful, very accessible, and really lovely to work with. I included as well a few examples that you can later on have a look at. So I'll skip through them very quickly because liberation psychology exists also outside of psychology, in business and community work. I've included some creative projects that you can look at. I won't do it in here because they're quite possibly destabilizing. So watch them at your own pace. And that's really it from me. I just want to check in how you're feeling in your body right now. If you could share on the chat, that would be wonderful. And we can still squeeze in 10 minutes for some questions. And while you're telling me how you're doing in your body right now, I'm also going to share all the links to the offerings that I have for you. You can join our group, very tiny group on LinkedIn. You can follow some of the reflective practices on Substack, and you can always talk to me. Just email me, talk to me, and I hope we can collaborate on some projects. But yes, please tell me how you're feeling in your body right now. Thank you, Jackie. I'm gonna stop sharing. If anyone has any questions or wants to add anything, please challenge me, call me out if I've used the word language that you found maybe outdated. It's really great to learn from other people. Thank you for sharing.
Not seeing any questions yet.
Mick?
Oh, Mick, sorry, Mick.
Yeah, no, it was a brilliant presentation, Sylwia, and it's great to see so much work out there. What can you tell us a little bit about, just in terms of kind of like communities and just kind of where it's located around the world? Is there, what's kind of going on in the UK? How do we get involved? How might tasks kind of link up?
I value your beautiful question, by the way, because it's very difficult to find a location for something that's ever so distributed. So first of all, we will find it in places that maybe you're a little bit more open. I personally found it easy to find them in Bristol, maybe then in Oxford, depending on the community. Every single charity I work through in Bristol is orientated towards this work. So this approach is embedded in the counselling that's already being done. So the sexual abuse service I work for works this way, the young people's service I worked for worked this way, and an addiction service I worked for worked this way. So it is already within the traditional psychological services. Oftentimes it's in somewhat alternative models, so nature groups, for example, or technology groups or VR therapies. Around the world, we will also find it in communities, and also in the UK, in the communities that maybe we consider indigenous or communities that sit outside of the kind of white Eurocentric forms of healing. And we might not even realize that that's what it is. So Dr. Thema Bryan, for example, oftentimes talks about polyvagal theory versus in Black American kind of spiritual tradition of going to the church and, moving and while singing and having this really comforting idea of movement and collective movement during the spiritual practices or dancing together. That also can be a form of healing. So it's kind of everywhere. And what's really, I think the books might be a good starting point to identify some projects. The first book I talked about lists plenty of them. Here in Bristol, we have the food justice projects across the country where we can go and get involved in growing food for the community and thinking about the nutrition side of, well-being. It really depends on what sits well with you and where you want to start to work. I work, for example, for me, it's promoting the digital technologies so that the kind of geek communities can enter the mental health spaces, because that's what I feel passionate about. So it's really, again, going back to finding a problem, finding something we feel passionate about, and looking out for people who do it in our area, and you will find someone.
Thank you.
And see how we can lend our mental health skills to that community. Possibly without taking the credit for it, as in, you know, not being the expert in the room, but actually entering and asking, we're growing food together, so what is my expertise needed? Is this going to help the young people to grow? If they're struggling, if they're in crisis, yes, I can take them aside and I can help them. But actually, it's a collective work. A lot of food cooking projects in the community as well, and a lot of art and kind of embodied practice as well. You'll find it in feminist movements. You'll find it in eco-feminist movements, queer therapies and communities as well. It's kind of all around us. I just need to notice it.
I had a question too, but I just want to check in with Jackie first in case you have something else. Or
Yeah, I was just thank you, Sylwia, for the amazing presentation. It's just so much food for thought. Thank you as well for bringing such important names such as Paulo Freire and other names that you brought to this presentation. So I think I sent you a question just now.
Yeah,
that
I
we
saw it.
had
You were asking.
received. Yeah.
You were asking about how I managed to read so many things. I actually like reading, and as I said at the beginning of my presentation, most of these books are available as audiobooks. Every single one of those names has a lot of YouTube videos, podcasts. They're really available in different accessible formats. It depends on what people like. I like the smell of paper, and I find it relaxing to read a book and immerse myself in something. And if I underline it, and you know, if it's practices, I come back to it. But I appreciate it, and sometimes I take an audiobook to my allotment and enjoy the nature and listen to something. It's so wonderful that these days we can actually listen to author's voice reading their own books as well. Yeah, and social media and kind of following people, and learning maybe from the response of current challenges as well, how practices are being put in place on the spot in response to, hey, this is happening, let's come together and find a way through it together collectively.
We have 1 minute. Is there anyone that would like to do a last quick question?
Sasha asked an important question, and I appreciate that I can sometimes come as very intense, and I like to have 3 or 4 thoughts of thinking at the same time. Where do we start? It really doesn't matter where you start. Pick your own place that feels good. I encourage as a playful practice to feel into it. Out of all the topics I've covered, what resonated with you the most? The first book, you know, Introduction to Liberation Psychologies might be a start. If you prefer to start historically, maybe Martin-Baró. Maybe you're a teacher, you prefer to start with Freire. Maybe you prefer to start with Embodied Practice. Whichever book you pick up or wherever you start your learning, it's kind of going to organically expand, and there's no right or wrong way of doing it. Just feel into it, immerse yourself into it. And remember what I said at the beginning, this can be hard work, heavy work. It is Psychologies of broken hearts. So there's something to be said about a slightly lighter approach to taking only as much as we can carry with people who can carry it with us. So if I was to name one starting point, reach out to your people, build up your community, build up a few people who can do it with you or support you, and start from there. I hope that responds to your question. And if there's more, I will maybe write a blog post about.
Thank you
But if
very
it
much.
feels daunting sometimes, that's a sign, right? As well, that's our resistance. That it's a lot to carry, and we can't carry it all the time. Sometimes we just need to put it down. Yeah, that's the last thing I wanted to say. So sorry, Jackie.